So we're gonna make another tutorial. So we're gonna open up, go to File, New, and I'm just gonna select on HD and put it at 24 frames per second. And so we're gonna make essentially a roller coaster to explore timing and spacing a little bit more extensively. So we're gonna make our track first. I'm gonna use the pen tool because this gives me a little bit more control. For those of you that are not familiar with Illustrator, we're using a Bezier curve, and this gives us a lot of control to manipulate the path. So I'm just going to draw. I set the stroke size to 3, so that way it is just a little bit more prominent. And so I want to make this roller coaster have a loop, because this is really going to emphasize the sense of weight. So I'm just drawing through, getting the shape more or less down, and we'll just draw this up here. You know, if you make mistakes, you can always go back in and edit it with the Bezier curve. And in order to edit it with the Bezier curve, you saw that I just went and changed my selection tool to the sub-selection tool, which is the white arrow. And so if I click on one of these anchor points, then you get the handles, and I can pretty much smooth everything out. Just zooming back out. I'm going to name this track. I'm actually going to duplicate this because we're going to use this track as a guide. And when we end up going back to playing through our final animation, the guide won't be visible in the final export or the Swift file. So we need to duplicate it so that way that track is visible later on. And I'll show you guys an example of that once we get to that point. So we have both the visible guide and then the track. I'm just gonna turn off the visibility of the visible one for the time being, so that way it's out of the way. I'm going to make our cart. So I took off the stroke because I just didn't think that was necessary. I'm going to make a new layer. We're going to name it. Let's put this cart. And I apologize that you can, the little buttons that I'm pressing, they're appearing in the lower left hand corner, and they might be covering up some stuff for us to see, but I think it's good for you to see some of the keystrokes that I'm using. And so I made that rectangle, I selected it, and then I turned it into an object. And now I'm placing it kind of over our track guide. Now what I'm actually going to do here is I'm going to right click and I'm going to actually turn that track guide layer into a guide. And it's going to turn this little icon into what looks like either a T-square or a little hammer. And now I have to drag the layer that I want to adhere to this guide and kind of snap it underneath. It'll indent. It'll give you a little bit of an indication of that. And now we know that it's going to essentially be parented to that guide. And now once we start going through the motions, it will essentially follow that track throughout the animation process. And so now we're going to kind of move it from point A to point B. And you will see that after we apply an in-between, so we'll right click, click on Create Classic Tween, we didn't have to do anything else. We just essentially have 2 keyframes. And you could see right there, I clicked on a checkbox, Orient to Path, and it automatically constrained that little cart so that way it would follow that path correctly. However, this doesn't really get us where we want. We need to do a lot more work because this is obviously not going to give us the kind of believable sense of motion that we are after. And even if we went through and really tweaked the different ease ins and ease outs and really manipulated the graph editor, we probably won't really get something realistic. So we're going to take this in a slightly more manual approach. And so we're going to add a lot of keyframes. So what I'm setting up right now is, you can see I created a new layer. It's called spacing. And on this layer, I'm essentially going to mark everywhere where I want to put a frame. I'm going to make a color that's pretty prominent, so I think I'm just going to go with red in this case. It'll stand out. And so I'm making one mark here, and we know at the top of a hill, well, it doesn't really have momentum. It's starting to gain. And so we're going to essentially have motion that's close together. And so you could see with the top of that loop, of this inversion, as those keyframes are going to be closer together, well, it's going to slow down. And then it's going to ramp back up as it gets down to the bottom of the hill. And so at this moment, I'm going through and I'm locking some of the layers, such as the spacing and the track guide, because I don't need to go back in and edit those. I want those to be kind of out of the way and not interfering with what I need to do next, which is placing this card. So as you can see here, I actually put the first keyframe every 4 frames, and then I decided to shift it. Truthfully, it doesn't really matter. However, the one thing that is important, whether it's 4 frames or 5 frames, I'm going to keep that spacing consistent in terms of putting a keyframe every other 5 frames or 4 frames. And by doing this, if I do one every 5 frames, but I adhere to kind of my marks in red that I've established, well, then we're going to get that illusion of weight. We're going to get that illusion of this object falling down a hill and being carried by mass through momentum, through this guided path. And so as you can see here, I'm just going through the motions of kind of setting each keyframe, having to extend the timeline a little bit in order to have enough room for me to put all this information in. And I think I'm about ready to finish this up in terms of setting our initial keyframes. So now let's kind of test it, see what it looks like. But first, we're going to add in the classic in between. And we'll see what this does. By controlling and manually setting most of our keyframes, we can actually allow the computer to more or less interpret in between each one. And so this way, we almost don't really have to worry about that graph editor of really putting in any of those tweens and really crafting those. Yes, we could still tweak it a little bit if we wanted to, but this is just a straight linear from point A to point B. Since we already controlled it using a very specified set of keyframes that we've established, it will do pretty much the job for us. Now, as you can see, I'm somewhat perplexed about how when I set all these keyframes, it's not really adhering to the established path that I had hoped for. It's not orienting to the path. So what this means is now I have to go in and use the transform tool, and for each one of these keyframes, manually adjust the orientation for our cart. Admittedly, this kind of sucks. It worked in that initial run through where I only had 2 keyframes, and it followed the path and it automatically oriented it. So that's one downside to this. So I'm just going through changing everything so that way this all seems pretty consistent and correct, and I still don't get it quite right once I do the playthrough, as you can see. Yes, this is all sped up, for your convenience, but I have to keep going through and tweaking it until we don't have anything that seems too wonky. And so I'm taking off that spacing because we don't really need it anymore. We'll play through this. It's starting to look good. And now we have that really believable sense of weight. It's not perfect, but I think now we have a better sense of how we can really control our animations using this program. We're going to go up to test to play through the movie. Admittedly, I always forget that it's under control. I always want to go to debug. And as you can see here, hey, I turned off those spacing marks, but they're appearing. Well, that's kind of annoying. So in order to control that, we'll go up to File, and we'll go down to Publish Settings. And in these Publish Settings, under Advanced, let me bring up the window a little bit more. We're going to click off Include Hidden Layers because we want it to not be present when we play it through. So now if we go to test, it's going to be exactly as we see it, except for that guide layer is gone. Remember at the very beginning, I said that the guide layer will not actually be visible when we play it through. So it's important for us to duplicate that layer in the very beginning. So we'll go back to track visible. We'll turn that on. Now when we go back to test our movie, we'll have it play exactly the way we want it in real time. And there we are. We have a fairly nicely controlled little animation playthrough of something that's kind of reminiscent of a roller coaster. So I kind of noticed that maybe this particular keyframe, it's actually maybe a little too even. So ultimately what I want to do is I want to shift this keyframe back up the hill so that way when it gets towards the very bottom of it, it seems like it's really speeding up. It's catching that momentum. This is the subtle thing. Once you get into the groove of animating, you'll have everything blocked in. That's essentially what we did with establishing our main keyframes in Animate. But now we start to get into the nuance. We can start pushing those in order to emphasize the weight and that sense of momentum just a little bit more. Now, this is not necessary, but I thought, well, if we're going to make it feel like a little roller coaster, why not have a distinction between either the middle ground and the foreground, and let's have that cart come back through. All of the process is exactly the same, but one thing you might want to keep in mind is, well, if it's coming in the foreground, it's probably a little bit further on its journey. It's probably not going as fast, so the momentum's going to be a little bit slower. So in this case, I'm actually spacing out where I put each keyframe on the timeline. So I could put it every 6 frames. And this will give me that slower pace. The other way that we could do this is, as I've indicated with the individual spacing on the timeline, as indicated by those red hash marks, well, I could just essentially put more of them closer together and still animate it every 5 frames in the timeline. That would give me the same illusion of it going slower. So there we have it. Now the last thing I wanted to show you is okay, how many times are we going to actually record or generate a roller coaster? Well, a guide can be really beneficial. So let's say that you're making a little video game and you have an animated sprite. So this was something that I actually did commercially a long time ago. And I was trying to get this walk cycle down. And so I used these guides to help create these shapes that they would move consistently along the same path for that walk cycle. And you could see the full playthrough there.